God's people have a long history of being mocked and threatened and having doubts sown among them. The history runs from Genesis to Revelation, from the snake in the garden who asked, "Did God really say?" to the messenger to Sennacherib who mocked King Hezekiah's God, to the Jewish leaders who mocked Jesus from the foot of the cross. If you're really the Son of God, come down. But one of the most revealing examples of mockery and threats against God's people is found in our passage today in Nehemiah. When Nehemiah and those who returned from exile began to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, local leaders like Sanballat and Tobiah first mocked and then threatened in order to sow doubt on God's plan. I believe that this mocking and threatening continues today against God's people. And only by fixing our eyes on a great and awesome God can we fight the fear these enemies wish to sow. Nehemiah says, don't be afraid of those who mock and threaten and sow doubt, because your God is awesome and mighty. All right, let's remind ourselves what's going on in Nehemiah. The people of Judah had been in exile in Babylon for 70 years. But a new ruler, Cyrus the Persian, had allowed Zerubbabel to return with the first group of the exiles, and slowly they rebuilt the destroyed temple. A generation or so later, Ezra had led a second group of exiles back to Israel and called the people back to following God. But Jerusalem's walls were still in ruins, making the city and the people vulnerable to every tribe and clan in the region. So God allowed Nehemiah to lead a third wave of returnees and to rebuild the wall. But this was not without opposition, especially from that local clan leader named Sanballat the Horonite and from his crony, Tobiah the Ammonite. Nevertheless, Nehemiah trusted in God and organized the people to rebuild the wall. And this didn't make Sanballat happy. And that's where our narrative picks up. Nehemiah 4, verses 1 through 5. Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes, what they're building. If a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and do not let their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders." The first form of opposition we want to look at is mockery. Sanballat hears that the Jews are rebuilding the walls, and he expresses his anger through mockery. He jeers at the Jews, and he gathers a bunch of his cronies, his minions, who he could force to listen to his cleverness. Only in this case, his minions include the army of Samaria. It's a pretty substantial threat, though under Persian hegemony, that army would have necessarily been very small. Anyway, he gathers his minions and he mocks. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? He says, will they revive the stones out of heaps of rubble, burned ones? And the word feeble there could be translated pathetic. Sanballat wants to think that the Jews are too few and the job too big for any hope of success. And in particular, he thinks the stones of the previous wall will have cracked in the great fire of its destruction. And that is something that can happen to that building material, limestone. But his mockery reminds me of VeggieTales, Josh on the Big Wall.
Oh, that's a great idea. You go ahead and keep walking. Keep walking, but but you won't knock down our wall. Keep walking. But she isn't gonna fall. It's plain to see. Your brains are very small to think walking will be knocking down our wall. You silly little pecan. You silly little peas. You think that walking around will bring this city to its knees? The awesome powers of this wall we've clearly demonstrated. But out here in the hot, hot sun, perhaps you're dehydrated?
God's people doing God's plan are often mocked. Tobiah the Ammonite is Sanballat's yes man. Sir Hiss to Sanballat's Prince John, LeFou to Sanballat's Gaston. He says, yes, what they're building. If a fox goes up on it, he'll break down their stone wall. He's saying, I'll take your mockery and I'll see you and raise you. I'll make an even bigger mockery. These guys are incompetent, they're weak. Even the light footsteps of a fox will knock it down. So the first form of fear-mongering from the enemies of God's people is mockery. Does this happen today? Consider the comments on a creation-evolution debate that was posted to YouTube. The scientific evolutionists constantly mock the ignorant creationists. Don't believe me? How about the commenter who said that this post should be titled Morons versus Intelligent People, Lies versus Honesty, Fairy Tales versus Reality, Rubbish versus Science, Creationism, what a cruel joke. And that sparked a debate about mockery and the so-called futility of confronting creationists with the facts, and led to the following little snippet of conversation. The guy says, I've tried explaining science to creationists, and I do it occasionally just to amuse myself. But then I feel guilty. Mocking retarded people is morally questionable, if not plain wrong. To which someone replied, I have great compassion for people with mental health problems, but there's a difference between those with mental health issues and the religious. Religious retardation is self-inflicted. Christians are mocked, not just creationists, but all of us, by sneering and innuendo and half-truths and non-truths. And we're usually mocked for believing the Bible. Bill Nye, the science guy, recently made a video supporting abortion. He tries to say that science proves that an embryo is not human. He claims it becomes human at implantation, not conception. Though absolutely no embryology textbook in the world would say that. But it's us, he says, who lack scientific understanding. He says, you literally don't know what you're talking about. When it comes to women's reproductive rights, I think you should leave it to women. You have a lot of men of European descent passing laws based on ignorance. Sorry, you guys. I know your interpretation of a book written 5,000 years ago, 50 centuries ago, makes you believe these things, but they're wrong. And to pass laws based on that belief is inconsistent, he says, with nature. You hear what he's saying to you? How stupid can you be to believe an old book instead of smart science? Though his one scientific fact is completely wrong, and of course so is his dating of the Bible. But this is what we encounter. So Sanballat, Tobiah, and these others are typical of the way people mock and belittle God's people even today. And Nehemiah responds in a way we often don't. He prays, hear, O our God, for we were despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads, and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. This is what theologians call an imprecatory prayer. A prayer calling down God's judgment on people. There are several psalms like this, and they're often quite graphic. We don't tend to pray this way. And to be honest, the New Testament authors don't really tend to pray this way. But in all these cases, the person praying has taken up God's cause because the people he's praying against are opposing God and his divine purpose. So Nehemiah doesn't personally take action against his opponents. There's no personal revenge, but he does trust God and call on God to take action. And to be honest, as I've watched these Planned Parenthood videos over the last months, I have, for the second time in recent memory, felt moved to pray this way. The first time was with ISIS and radical Islam. But this drives me crazy. I don't know or even care what laws these abortionists have broken, but the cavalier, the callous attitude toward thousands of deaths, the joking about intact, and sometimes even living babies, those things do move you to say, "Oh, Lord, judge." So Sanballat and Tobiah were masters of mockery. We live in a culture where Christians and moral values are increasingly mocked. But Sanballat did more than that. Verses 6 to 9 and verse 11. So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. In verse 11, and our enemies said, "They will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work." Notice first that in response to the mockery, Nehemiah prayed, verses 4 and 5 that we just looked at. And then verse 6, they got back to work, doing what God had called them to do, doing what was being opposed, building the wall. That's not a bad formula for dealing with opposition. Rather than be derailed by mockery, we pray that it will not impede God's work, and then we do the work God has given us. If we pray that prayer but don't do the work, we're de-answering our own prayer. Later, Sanballat will try to distract Nehemiah by calling him out for high-level negotiations or something, but Nehemiah says, "Hey, I'm doing a great work here. I can't come down." Often we're called to just keep doing the work God has called us to do. But if we do, we may run into these direct threats. Sanballat and Tobiah and their allies, the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites, whoever they were, heard the Jews were repairing the walls. They were angry. They didn't want a strong and well-protected non-ally in their backyard, especially one that seemed to be in favor with the Persians. So they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem to cause confusion. And they said, verse 11, they're not going to know, they're not going to see until we come among them and kill them and stop the work. And we know from the surrounding verses that these words reached the ears of Nehemiah and God's people. And notice, verse 9, how Nehemiah responds again. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. Pray and do. That's the practical response to mockery and threats. It's a practical response to all kinds of fears. Pray and do the next thing. Elizabeth Elliot, who went home to be with the Lord this year, influenced many of us. One of her frequent counsels was, do the next thing. She was quoting from an old poem that in part says, do it immediately, do it with prayer. Do it reliantly, casting all care. Do it with reverence, tracing his hand who placed it before thee with earnest command. Stayed on an omnipotence, safe neath his wing, leave all resultings, do the next thing. Don't fear the outcome. Don't fear the threats. Just pray, trust God, and do the next thing. So do we ever receive threats in our culture? Yeah. Mocked, threatened, and showered at times with seeds of doubt. Now, sometimes threats are obvious because there's a real danger behind them. On a global scale, the persecution and martyrdom of Christians is at the highest level ever. And we need always to remember that the family of believers, our brothers and sisters, is undergoing this suffering. We need to suffer with them in prayer. Just this week, I found an article on the execution of Assyrian Christians in ISIS captivity. When I preached from Isaiah 19 some years ago, I learned that a remnant of Assyria had come to faith in Jesus shortly after the resurrection, as prophesied by Isaiah, and that Assyrian Christian church has survived for 2,000 years. In fact, one of those Assyrian Christians commented on the video that I put up online with that sermon. But now, ISIS seems to be systematically wiping out that church. In this video, the three men, if you would listen, they give their names, they give their identity, they identify as Christians, and then they're shot, which I'm not going to show you. But the sad thing is this video had only 699 views a week after it was posted. Yeah, killing Christians in jumpsuits is now old news. Nobody's interested anymore. But we need to be, because the threat is real. It's happening to our brothers and sisters. In the same way, but to a lesser degree in our own country, we are subject to threats. If you're a florist or a baker or own a wedding venue and you believe that marriage is God's design for one man and one woman, you will be threatened and maybe even tested. Now, you may be perfectly willing to provide a cake or a location, regardless of sexual orientation or anything else, for any event that does not portray itself as a Christian marriage. But many of us would feel that you can't affirm as godly, you can't bless a so-called marriage that goes against God's design. If you're that person, you'll receive threats, social shaming, a lawsuit, maybe even an exorbitant fine, like the owners of the bakery in Colorado. Maybe you'll have to stop hosting weddings entirely, as the farm in New York did. And like these people, you may come to the place where you have to say, we're going to serve God and not man. The threats are there. They're real. But there's more to it than that, because to a great extent, the purpose of the mockery and the threats is mostly to sow doubt among us, among God's people. Verses 10 to 15, in Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And then our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. So, in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. And that's where they do the trowel in one hand and the sword in the other hand thing. But the impact of mockery and threats is often discouragement and doubt. That may be the main point of the attack. The Jewish people look at their half-built wall and how much work is left, and they're tempted to give up. Our strength is failing. There's too much rubble. We're not going to make this work. And it's at that point that the enemy chimes in with their threats and their mockery. And these threats discourage not only the workers, but their families, the greater population. So the next thing you know, the family and friends, the mothers and the wives and the children are showing up at the city, and they're reinforcing these doubts and fears. They're saying, this is hopeless. This is useless. This is doomed. For your own safety and our peace, give up. Come home. Don't be trapped here when the destruction happens. And it's just human nature that would multiply doubt and fear. Notice how Nehemiah says this was repeated 10 times from all directions. Doubt and fear are easy to cause. Do you remember when Hurricane Rita was approaching the Gulf Coast? It was a real threat, kind of unlike what we had this weekend, but 175-mile-an-hour winds, and at one point the forecast was that the dirty side would go right over Houston. It was also 3 weeks after Katrina, and though the point of projected impact kept drifting east and the winds started to drop, the media kept screaming, fear-mongering. Officials expected about 1 million people in the coastal area to evacuate. Instead, 2.5 million people got in their cars at the same time, and chaos ensued. Most of you remember it. Temperatures were near 100 degrees. There was no fuel available, and the entire region was gridlocked. 125 people died. That's the outcome the enemy wants when by mockery and threats he sows doubt and fear and even panic among God's people. In Tales of the Kingdom by David and Karen Maines, a key refrain of the enemy's servants is, nothing can be done, nothing is being done, nothing will be done, nay, nay, nay. That's what doubt wants us to believe. The enemy's goal in threats and attacks against God's people isn't so much to wipe out the church, but to silence, dilute, and disempower the church. I read an article recently in the New York Times, Sunday edition, an editorial, but purporting to convey the way things really are among Christians. It mocked, it threatened, it sowed doubt, it bred cowardice and compromise among God's people, to anyone who isn't fully convinced of their commitment to God's word. Okay, so here's how it went. It's called Bigotry, the Bible, and the Lessons of Indiana. It was written on April 3rd, 2015, when the argument du jour was over the Indiana Religious Freedom Act. You remember that? It was regarded by the LGBT community as giving religious bigots the freedom to discriminate against them. Frank Bruni, who writes for the New York Times on politics and culture, says, the drama in Indiana last week and the larger debate over so-called religious freedom laws in other states portray homosexuality and devout Christianity as forces in collision. They're not, at least not in several prominent denominations, which have come to a new understanding of what the Bible does and doesn't decree. Homosexuality and Christianity don't have to be in conflict in any church, anywhere. That many Christians regard them as incompatible is understandable. An example not so much of hatred's pull as of tradition's sway. But in the end, the continued view of gays, lesbians, and bisexuals as sinners is a decision. It's a choice. It prioritizes scattered passages of ancient texts over all that has been learned since, as if time had stood still, as if the advances of science and knowledge meant nothing. Do you hear what he's doing? He's mocking. He's mocking the faith. He's mocking the scriptures. He's sneering at anyone who would hold on to them in the face of all this knowledge that we've gained. The scriptures, he says, reflect the biases and blind spots of their authors, cultures, and errors. Interpretation of them, he says, is subjective, debatable. So religious freedom should free religions and religious people from prejudices that they no longer need to cling to, rightly bowing to the enlightenment of modernity. He then quotes renegade scholars and what used to be Christian institutions who say, human understanding of what is sinful has changed over time. That some people have now an evolved sense of right and wrong. I mean, don't you want to have that? an evolved sense of right and wrong about sexual matters, about gender matters, about things that were part of the culture and history of the Bible but are not appropriate for us today. He's trying to sow doubt in the minds of people half-heartedly attached to Scripture. And when he's done that, then he begins to threaten. He says, Indiana demonstrated anew that religion will be the final holdout and most stubborn refuge for homophobia. It will give license to discrimination. It will cause gay and lesbian teenagers in fundamentalist households to agonize needlessly. Conservative Christian religion is the last bulwark against full acceptance of LGBT people. And I want to stop and point out that I believe in full acceptance of LGBT people. I just don't believe that you can do that without also recognizing that all are sinners and that there are sins involved in LGBT lifestyles, just as there are sins involved in some kind of heterosexual lifestyles. And he goes there. He says most Christians support marriage equality. Well, yeah, not exactly, but especially, he says, mainline Protestants and Catholics, and even evangelicals, he teases, are coming to this position, looking at these ancient texts and understanding them differently. He cites the 2014 book, God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Vines, as an eloquent take on what the New Testament really communicates. The New Testament, like the Old, outlines bad and good behaviors that almost everyone deems archaic and irrelevant today. Why deem the descriptions of homosexual behavior any differently? So having mocked and sneered and sown doubt, Bruni closes with threats at the end of his article. He quotes Michael Gold, an activist who founded an organization which aims to mitigate the damage done to LGBT people by religious-based bigotry. Gold told me that church leaders must be made to take homosexuality off the sin list. They must be made to take it off this list. And then Bruni says, this demand is worthy. It's warranted. All of us, no matter our religious traditions, should know better than to tell gay people that they're an offense, which we're not. But he says that's precisely what the florists and bakers who wanted to turn them away are saying. He's trying to drive this wedge through mockery and doubt and threat, a wedge between us and the biblical truth. And those are the tools the enemy uses to create fear among God's people. So how does Nehemiah respond? Verse 13. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. He sets the people into a defensive position. Verse 14, and I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. Do not be afraid. We're not surprised to hear that. And we've learned that we want to look not only to the context, the kind of fear that we're commanded to avoid, but also in these passages for characteristics of God that makes the fear unnecessary. So this fear arises when we're mocked or threatened and when doubts are born. Can God really do this? Is this too dangerous? Am I deluded to think this truth worth defending? Isn't there a less controversial way to cling to the faith? Is this even worth it in the face of overwhelming odds? Threats and mockery lead to doubts and fears. But God is able. Do not fear. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. In addition to prayer and work in the direct facing of fear, Nehemiah says, remember the Lord. Call to mind what you know about God, the things that he has promised, and especially the things that he has done. If you can't call those things to mind, open his word. and find out what he has promised. Find out what he has done. And you'll find a God who is great and awesome. He is not threatened, he is not mocked, and he is not daunted. Nothing is too difficult for God. No power can thwart his plan. No circumstance can derail his victory or modify his purpose of calling to himself from every tribe and tongue and people and nation and lifestyle a people for his own possession. God is great and awesome. Nehemiah is probably quoting Deuteronomy 7. As I said this morning, he had his quiet time here. If you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt, the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs, the wonders, the mighty hand, and the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God brought you out. So will the Lord your God do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. You shall not be in dread of them, for the Lord your God is in your midst, great and awesome God. It should also come as no surprise by now that the word awesome there is fearful, awful. God is great and to be feared. And if we fear God, then we will not fear man. Psalm 56:11, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? If I fear God and recognize his greatness, I can not fear the threats and mockery of men. Even threats that are quite real, I need not fear. Nehemiah says to pray, to work, and to bring to mind the greatness of God, as we already have in worship this morning, so that you fear him and not men. And then verse 14, fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. They'd arm themselves, they would fight if necessary, but they would do it in dependence on a great and awesome God. Verse 15, when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. God had already removed the threat from them. And so in the face of threats, in the face of mockery, in the face of the doubts that our culture wants to paralyze us with, we have no choice but to pray and to continue with the work God has called us to, and to remember that he is great and awesome.